He broke her heart and never looked back. 5 years later, he saw her again, with 3 daughters who had his eyes. Graham Weston didn't make mistakes. At least not publicly. As the CEO of Weston International, he was known for precision, discipline, and an icy calm that unsettled even the boldest competitors. At 36, he had built an empire from the ground up, and everything about him reflected control, from his meticulously tailored suits to the way he paused exactly 2 seconds before answering any question. His blonde hair was always perfectly in place, his blue eyes sharp and unreadable, and his rules, both personal and professional, were carved in stone. One of those rules was simple: never get involved with anyone in your company. And yet, there was Madison Brooks. She had entered his life quietly as his executive assistant, professional, organized, discreet. With soft brown hair, calm blue eyes, and a steady presence, she never tried to impress or flirt. She simply did her job better than anyone else ever had. That was what made her dangerous. She never crossed a line, never asked for anything, and that restraint intrigued him far more than boldness ever could. Their connection built itself in silence, through late nights at the office, glances that lasted a second too long, the way she knew what he needed before he asked. There was no grand spark. Just a slow, undeniable pull. It all came to a head in London. They were there for a week-long investment conference, and the hours were grueling. On the 4th night, after a long day of presentations and networking, Graham invited Madison to dinner, not in a hotel restaurant, but in a quiet, tucked-away bistro far from the corporate buzz. He told himself it was professional. She probably told herself the same. But the wine flowed, their conversation softened, and when they stepped outside into the cool night air, something shifted. She looked up at him, and for once, he didn't look away. Their eyes locked for too long, and when he kissed her, it wasn't calculated, it was instinct. Urgent. Needed. She kissed him back, and in that moment, the world he'd built around rules and image dissolved. They spent the night together. It was more than physical. It was raw, unfiltered, and terrifyingly real. The next morning, everything changed. He didn't say much. Barely looked at her during the flight back. By the time they landed in New York, the wall was back in place, thicker than ever. Madison didn't press him. She returned to her desk, did her job, and said nothing. 3 days later, he called her into his office. His face was unreadable. His voice, flat. "We crossed a line," he said. "It was unprofessional. It can't happen again." She stood still, silent. "I want to keep things clean. You don't have to leave. But it's best if we forget it ever happened." Her chest rose, then fell slowly. She nodded, once. Understood. He turned back to his computer as if she were already gone. But she didn't come back the next day. Instead, she resigned by email. No confrontation. No scene. Just a formal, polite goodbye. Graham stared at the screen after reading her message. For a moment, just a moment, he felt something like regret stir in his chest. But he buried it. She had been a complication. A mistake. And he didn't make mistakes. At least, not ones he couldn't forget. Or so he thought. Madison didn't look back. She left the office building with her head high and her heart in pieces. The cool autumn air hit her face as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, but she didn't feel it. Her resignation had been short, professional, and to the point, no explanations, no dramatic exits. She packed her things in silence, handed her keycard to HR, and walked out of Graham Weston's world as if she'd never been part of it. But inside, she was crumbling. She returned to her small apartment that night and didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the floor in the dark, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to process how quickly something that had felt so intense, so real, had been reduced to a mistake and brushed aside like a stain on a white shirt. She wasn't naive. She knew office relationships were dangerous territory, especially with someone like him. But she had believed, if only for a brief moment, that what happened in London meant something more. And that belief now felt like the cruelest kind of foolishness. Days blurred together. She applied for new jobs, updated her resume, and tried to ignore the gnawing emptiness in her chest. But then, 2 weeks later, everything changed. She woke up feeling strange, tired in a way that didn't feel normal, her stomach uneasy, her body off balance. She dismissed it at first, blaming stress and poor sleep. But when the feeling lingered, a quiet fear began to build. A trip to the drugstore. A single test. 2 pink lines. She stared at them for a full minute before her knees gave out and she sank to the bathroom floor. Tears streamed down her face, not from joy, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming weight of not knowing what came next. 1,000 thoughts collided in her head. Tell him? Don't tell him? Could she even raise a child? How would she afford it alone? The next day, she scheduled a doctor's appointment to confirm. The nurse smiled warmly after the ultrasound began, but then paused and tilted her head at the screen. "Everything looks good," she said carefully. "Very good, in fact. Madison, it's triplets." Madison stared at her, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" 3 heartbeats, the nurse said, pointing. "They're all measuring well." Madison didn't remember walking out of the clinic. She didn't remember the cab ride home. All she remembered was curling up on her couch and trying to breathe through the panic. 1 child was life-changing. 3? Alone? With no job, no support, and no way to know how she'd make it past next month. But as the shock slowly gave way to something deeper, Madison realized what she had to do. She would not go back to Graham. Not for money, not for help, not for anything. He had made his choice, cold, calculated, final. She wouldn't give him the chance to reject them too. The only thing worse than doing this alone would be letting him walk in and out of their lives on his terms. So she started over. She sold what little she had of value and moved to a quiet town a few hours away, one no one would think to look for her in. She found a tiny, run-down cottage on the edge of a rural neighborhood and began working remotely, taking on freelance writing jobs, editing papers, doing whatever she could from home. She learned to budget every cent. She read every parenting book she could find. She built a support system from scratch, a kind neighbor who offered rides, a retired teacher who helped her apply for state programs, a local church that donated baby supplies. The pregnancy was hard. Her body ached constantly, and she lived in fear of complications. But with each passing month, the fear softened into something stronger, resolve. The day her daughters were born, Sophie, Bella, and Jane, was the most terrifying and beautiful day of her life. They came early, but they were fighters, tiny and fierce, with tufts of pale blonde hair and impossibly blue eyes. Madison cried the first time she held all 3 together, not from exhaustion, but from something that felt like purpose finally taking shape. She didn't think about Graham anymore. Not consciously, at least. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, when she rocked one baby to sleep while the others stirred in their cribs, she would wonder what he would say if he saw them. Would he recognize his own eyes? Would he feel guilt? Pride? Love? But she never let herself linger in those questions for long. She had chosen her path. And now, she wasn't just Madison Brooks. She was a mother of 3. And they were her entire world. The years passed slowly and mercilessly. Each day blurred into the next as Madison adjusted to the relentless rhythm of motherhood multiplied by 3. Life wasn't just hard, it was bone-deep exhausting, the kind of exhaustion that never truly left her body, even in sleep. The cottage she had moved into was small but safe, tucked away at the edge of a sleepy town where nobody asked too many questions. The neighbors were kind in the way small-town people often are, quietly helpful without prying. And Madison, once sharp and ambitious and neatly dressed in heels, now lived in sweatshirt stained with formula, her hair always tied up in a messy knot, her hands always full. The girls, Sophie, Bella, and Jane, grew fast. Too fast. One moment they were fragile infants who couldn't lift their own heads, and the next they were toddlers with opinions, voices, and boundless energy. Madison loved them with a depth that sometimes scared her. Each of them carried something of Graham in their features, the delicate curl of hair around their ears, the curve of their jaws, the clarity of their eyes. But none of them had his silence. Her daughters were loud, expressive, and full of life. They talked over each other, sang nonsense songs, demanded more cereal than she had in the pantry, and filled the house with something it had never had before, sound. But even in all that joy, there was loneliness. Madison never admitted it out loud, but there were nights she sat in the dark after the girls were asleep, watching the rain hit the windows and wondering if anyone else in the world remembered her. She didn't regret her decision, keeping the girls, leaving Graham, starting over, but the isolation wore on her spirit like erosion. There was no one to lean on when one child was sick and the others were screaming. No one to help at 3 in the morning when the power went out and the babies cried in the dark. No one to share the small victories, like the first time Sophie said "Mama," or when Jane counted to 10 without help. Still, she survived. She found work as an online editor and part-time art teacher at the local community center. She painted late at night when the girls were asleep, using old supplies and donated canvases. Her art was no longer abstract or experimental. It was intimate now, portraits of motherhood, glimpses of tiny fingers, soft light through curtains, 3 matching shoes at the doorstep. Her studio was the corner of her kitchen, but somehow it felt more honest than any gallery she'd ever worked in. Money remained tight. She clipped coupons and sewed patches on their clothes. Her phone was old, her car older, but her girls never went hungry, never felt unloved. She had made a world for them, even if it was built from scraps. The idea of dating never occurred to her. It wasn't just the time or the exhaustion, it was the fear of letting someone in again. What if she trusted the wrong person? What if her daughters were hurt by her mistakes? She couldn't afford to gamble with their hearts the way she had once gambled with her own. Graham had burned her in a quiet, precise way that didn't leave bruises but scars. She had built her whole life now around avoiding that kind of wound. She didn't follow his success, though headlines still found her sometimes by accident, magazines in grocery store checkout lines or articles shared by old contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Graham Weston, the untouchable CEO, the tech investment king, the face of modern capitalism. He was everywhere and nowhere at once, always looming behind her like a shadow she pretended not to see. But Madison had changed. She wasn't the 20-something assistant who fell for her boss in a foreign hotel. She was a mother, a survivor, a woman who carried her entire world in the shape of 3 small girls with tangled hair and sticky fingers. And if there were moments she sat in silence and wondered what could have been, if he had stayed, if he had cared, if he had tried, she never let those thoughts grow roots. She had made peace with being forgotten. Or at least, she thought she had. But fate has a strange way of bringing back what we bury deepest. And one crisp autumn morning, with her girls laughing in the backyard and a fresh canvas waiting in her kitchen, her past began to stir, quietly, invisibly, and far beyond her control. Somewhere across the state, a man she hadn't seen in 5 years was about to walk into a gallery, glance at a photo, and realize everything he thought was finished had only just begun. It happened on a Thursday. Graham Weston arrived at the Modern Art Museum in downtown Manhattan as a formality, not expectation. He was scheduled to make a brief appearance at an event hosted by one of his company's philanthropic branches, a foundation that supported underrepresented artists and educators in smaller communities. It was a gesture for press, a nod to giving back, one more checkbox in the corporate social responsibility handbook. He didn't even plan to stay long. He would shake a few hands, take a photo near a sculpture, and leave. That was the plan. He moved through the exhibit slowly, politely, as assistants and curators hovered nearby, waiting for his approval or a passing comment. The exhibit was charming, even inspiring, in a raw and quiet way. Small-town teachers, parents, and volunteers had submitted pieces made with limited resources but abundant emotion. It wasn't polished, but it was honest, and something about that tugged at him in a way he couldn't name. Then he saw it. He didn't notice the artist's name first. He noticed the painting. It was a portrait, oil on canvas, soft yet vivid. A woman stood in the doorway of a small cottage, holding the hands of 3 identical little girls. The colors were warm, but the tone was haunting. The woman's eyes, blue, deep, familiar, looked directly out at the viewer, full of something unspoken. The children clung to her like stars orbiting their center. And there was something about the image that made him stop breathing for a second. He stepped closer, drawn in by a detail he couldn't explain. He stared at the woman's face. It couldn't be. Could it? He glanced down at the placard beside the painting. Artist, Madison Brooks. Title, The Center of the Universe. Location, Maple Glen, New York. His world stopped. A rush of memory slammed into him. London, her eyes in candlelight, the feel of her hand in his, the moment she walked out of his office for the last time. He had buried that chapter so thoroughly it felt unreal to see it surface again, not in conversation, but on canvas. He looked back at the painting. The woman was her. There was no doubt. And the girls. The girls had soft blonde curls, small oval faces, and startlingly familiar blue eyes. Not hers. His. Graham felt something inside him crumble. He stepped back slightly, as if the painting had struck him. An assistant noticed his sudden stillness and approached. "Mr. Weston? Is everything all right?" He didn't answer. He was already moving, walking down the line of artwork until he found a small section with bios and artist statements. There it was again, her name, her photo. Madison, standing beside the painting, smiling softly, wearing an apron splattered with paint. In the short paragraph beneath her photo, it mentioned she was a single mother of 3, running a community art center in upstate New York. He read the lines again. And again. Single mother of 3. 3. The air felt thinner, heavier, as if the walls had closed in. He stepped outside without a word, ignoring the voices calling after him, and sat in the back of his town car with the door slammed shut behind him. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to gather himself, but the thoughts were already spiraling. They were his. They had to be. The timeline made sense. The resemblance was undeniable. And Madison had never told him. Never reached out. Not once. At first, anger surged through him. Why hadn't she said anything? Why had she disappeared, taken his children, and erased him from their lives? But just as quickly, that anger gave way to something else, guilt. He had made her leave. He had shut the door. He had treated her like a mistake, a breach of protocol, and then walked away without asking what it had cost her. He had no right to be angry. Only the unbearable truth remained. He was a father. And he hadn't even known it. His chest ached with 1,000 thoughts. Were they safe? Did they know about him? Had they ever asked? Were they told he didn't care? He imagined them asking where their dad was and Madison hesitating to answer. He imagined birthday parties without him, scraped knees he hadn't kissed, lullabies he hadn't sung. Entire lives he had missed while he stood behind a desk pretending control meant something. He couldn't sit still. That same day, he told his assistant to cancel his evening. He had a new destination. He found the address of the art center in Maple Glen and booked a private driver to take him upstate the next morning. He didn't call ahead. He couldn't. He didn't even know what he would say. All he knew was that the woman he had once called a mistake had given him the 3 greatest truths of his life. And he had no idea if she would even open the door. The drive to Maple Glen was long, winding through narrow highways and quiet forest-lined roads, but Graham barely noticed the scenery. His thoughts raced with every mile, bouncing between panic, disbelief, and a rising urgency that clawed at his chest. It wasn't just about seeing Madison again, it was about what he hadn't been there for, what he hadn't known. No meeting, no acquisition, no billion-dollar contract had ever made his hands shake like they did now. He was a man known for control, but now he felt utterly unmoored. By the time the car pulled up to the small art center at the edge of town, his suit felt too stiff, his breath too shallow. The building was modest, with a mural painted along one side, bright colors, children's handprints, playful shapes. There was something disarmingly pure about it. A place built for joy, not business. A woman stepped outside holding a clipboard, but it wasn't Madison. He waited until she went inside before walking up the path to the front door. He hesitated. 5 years of silence couldn't be undone with a knock. But he lifted his hand anyway and tapped. Footsteps. Light ones. The door creaked open. She stood there in the doorway, exactly as he remembered her and completely different all at once. Madison looked older, yes, but stronger too. Her brown hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and her blue eyes locked onto his with instant, cutting recognition. There was no surprise in her face, just stillness, like she'd expected this moment to come eventually, even if she never admitted it to herself. Graham opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he say? I didn't know. I'm sorry. How are they? He realized in that moment how inadequate language could be. What are you doing here? Her voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't warm either. It was guarded, even, edged with fatigue and something that sounded almost like caution. I saw your painting, he said finally, the words dry in his throat. At the gallery in Manhattan. Her expression didn't change. I assumed. I didn't know, Madison, he added, softer now. About them. I didn't know. She stared at him for a long time. Not blinking. Not speaking. Her silence screamed louder than anything she could have said. I need to see them, he said. Please. They don't know who you are, she replied calmly. They've never asked. I didn't tell them because I didn't think you'd ever care to know. That's not fair, he said quickly, but then stopped himself. Because it was. She had every right to feel that way. She opened the door slightly wider. They're in the back, she said. Painting. Like they do every morning. He followed her through the modest center, his shoes clicking softly on the wooden floors. Children's artwork covered the walls, vivid colors, hand-scrawled names, drawings of houses, animals, and sometimes messy hearts. Then he saw the room. A small studio filled with morning light. And 3 little girls, sitting at a table, focused intently on their paintings. They were identical. His breath caught as he took in the sight of them. Blonde curls. Pink cheeks. Matching aprons streaked with paint. And those eyes, his eyes. All 3 turned to look at him as he stood there, frozen in the doorway. Madison stepped inside first. Girls, she said gently, we have a guest. They stared at him with a mix of curiosity and caution. They didn't speak, didn't smile, but they didn't look away either. "This is Graham," she added after a moment. "He's someone from my past." One of them, he didn't yet know which, tilted her head and asked, "Did he paint too?" The question hit him like a stone to the chest. "No," he said with a small, broken smile. "But I wish I had." The girls returned to their painting, not quite understanding, but accepting his presence. Children were like that, far more open than adults, less burdened by history. He stood there, watching them for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of time he could never get back. Madison walked him out to the front steps when it was time to go. "I don't expect anything," he said quietly. "Not forgiveness. Not answers. But I want to know them, if you'll let me. I want to try." She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just looked at him with eyes that held years of heartbreak and resilience. "I'll think about it," she said, and closed the door gently behind her. And Graham Weston stood alone on the porch, staring at the paint-streaked windows, feeling more lost and more certain than he'd ever been in his life. The next morning, Graham returned. He didn't bring flowers or gifts or any rehearsed speech. Instead, he stood once again at the doorstep of the small art center, unsure if Madison would open the door at all. To his surprise, she did. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much, but there was a faint softness in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She didn't say anything, she simply stepped aside to let him in. That day began a pattern. He came quietly each morning, never pushing, never staying too long. At first, the girls treated him like a visiting stranger, polite, curious, but distant. He didn't try to explain who he was or what he meant to them. Instead, he knelt on the floor beside them and asked what they were painting. He listened. He helped them mix colors. He held their cups of water when they needed a new brush. And slowly, their boundaries began to shift. On the third day, Jane offered him a crayon. The next, Sophie asked if he could draw a dog. He tried, and failed, and the girls laughed so hard they knocked over the paint jars. That laughter did something to him. It reached deep inside a part of him he'd sealed off long ago, a part that had forgotten what it was to be vulnerable and welcome at the same time. Graham, who once gave million-dollar pitches without blinking, found himself sweating while trying to glue pipe cleaners onto a paper crown. Madison observed from a quiet distance, always watching, always measuring. She was waiting, he knew, for him to flinch, to retreat, to grow bored or overwhelmed and vanish again. But he didn't. Every day he returned, he showed up with no demands, no expectations. Only presence. One afternoon, as the girls ran ahead toward the playground, he stayed behind to help clean brushes. Madison finally spoke to him with something more than instructions or warnings. "They don't understand who you are," she said, her tone cautious. "Not yet. I never wanted them to grow up wondering why their father wasn't there." "I understand," he replied, rinsing paint off his hands. "You didn't owe me anything. I forfeited that right the moment I let you walk away." She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't let me walk away. You pushed me." The honesty in her words sliced through him, but he didn't defend himself. There was nothing left to argue. She was right. Later that week, as they sat outside on a bench watching the girls chase each other through the grass, one of them, Bella, he thought, climbed into his lap without saying a word. She curled against him, her blonde curls brushing his chin, and pointed to the sky. "That one's my cloud," she said proudly. He looked up and smiled. "Looks like a rabbit." "No," she said firmly. "It's a crown. For Mama." He felt his throat tighten, overwhelmed by how casually children could offer something so pure, so full of meaning. He glanced over at Madison, who sat with her elbows on her knees, watching the two other girls play. She didn't look at him, but he knew she had heard. It wasn't just the children who were opening up. They began spending weekends together. Simple things: picnics in the park, pancakes on Sunday mornings, sidewalk chalk drawings on the front steps. It wasn't about repairing the past. It was about building something new, slowly, honestly, from the ground up. Graham learned their routines. He helped braid their hair, burned grilled cheese sandwiches, and read bedtime stories with exaggerated voices that made the girls giggle uncontrollably. He made mistakes, accidentally shrinking their favorite shirts in the wash, tripping over dolls left in the hallway, but he never ran. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Madison found him in the kitchen cleaning up dishes. "They love you," she said softly, drying her hands on a towel. He looked at her, unsure how to respond. "And they don't even know why." He set down the plate in his hand and turned to face her. "Then tell me what I need to do to be worthy of that." She didn't answer immediately. She leaned against the counter and studied him, really looked at him, as though trying to decide if the man before her was the same one who had once broken her heart. "You're doing it," she finally said. And with that, the space between them began to shrink. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. And for Graham, that was everything. Summer came gently to Maple Glen. The trees grew fuller, the days stretched longer, and the girls' laughter echoed more often through the backyard where the grass grew a little too wild and chalk drawings covered the patio. Graham had started coming not just in the mornings, but staying through the evenings. It was no longer about proving something, it had become a rhythm, natural, steady, unspoken. The girls expected him. They waited by the window when he was late, ran to greet him at the door with sticky hands and paint-streaked cheeks, and climbed into his lap without hesitation. They still didn't know the full truth, but in their minds, he was no longer just Mr. Graham. He had quietly, carefully become part of their every day. He picked them up from preschool, helped with their little art projects, sat through their dance class recitals and clapped louder than anyone in the room. And Madison, she had started to soften. It began in small ways. She smiled more when he was near. She no longer flinched when their hands brushed while passing a glass of water. She laughed, actually laughed, when he tried to fix the kitchen cabinet and ended up making the entire drawer fall out. Their conversations grew longer, deeper. She told him about the girls' quirks, how Bella was fiercely independent, how Sophie refused to eat anything green, and how Jane had imaginary friends she insisted needed their own chair at the dinner table. He listened to everything like it mattered. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying all of it alone. One Saturday afternoon, they all went to the county fair. The girls rode the carousel until they were dizzy with joy, and Graham won them oversized stuffed animals at a game booth, missing every shot but one. He and Madison shared cotton candy and sat on the grass beneath a tree while the girls took turns pushing each other on the swing. The moment was simple, almost ordinary, but something in the way Graham looked at her made her chest tighten. It wasn't lust or longing, it was something far more dangerous. It was trust. That night, after the girls fell asleep in the back seat of the car, Graham carried them one by one into the house, tucking them gently under blankets, brushing curls away from foreheads. Madison stood in the doorway of their shared room and watched him with a look that held everything she hadn't dared to say for years. When they stepped into the hallway, the air between them changed. "I don't know what we're doing," she said quietly, her arms folded, but not defensively. "I didn't expect this." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Neither did I. But I know it's the only thing that's felt right in a very long time." Madison didn't reply. She simply turned and walked into the kitchen. He followed. She poured 2 cups of tea and slid one across the counter. They sat across from each other at the table, steam curling in the space between them. "I was angry for a long time," she admitted. "Not just at you, at myself, too. For trusting you. For letting you in." "You had every right to be," he said. "I was a coward." She blinked, caught off guard by the admission. "You always seemed so sure of yourself." "I was sure of the wrong things," he replied. "Of rules. Control. Boundaries. I was terrified of anything real." Madison looked down at her cup, her fingers tracing the rim. "And now?" "Now I'm terrified of losing something real." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with meaning, charged with the weight of 5 lost years and the slow, painful journey back to this shared table. Then she said, very softly, "They ask about you, you know. Not directly, but they know you're important." He smiled faintly. "They're important to me. All of them. And you." Madison met his eyes. "Do you mean that, or do you think you should say it?" "I mean it," he said without hesitation. "More than anything I've ever said in my life." She stood slowly and walked around the table. He rose too, instinctively. They stood inches apart, the silence between them now stretched thin and shimmering. She reached up and touched the side of his face, just once, as if to make sure he was real. "I'm not the same woman you left," she said. "I know," he whispered. "And I'm not the same man who walked away." He leaned in then, not urgently, not like someone claiming something, but like someone asking. Their lips met gently, and when she didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss with quiet reverence. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was something found after being lost too long. That night, he didn't stay. He kissed her forehead, whispered goodnight, and left her on the porch with her thoughts and the stars above. But something had shifted, finally, undeniably, and both of them knew. The door had opened again. And this time, neither of them planned to let it close. Autumn returned to Maple Glen with a kind of slow, golden grace. The leaves turned in waves, amber, crimson, gold, and the scent of wood smoke and apples lingered in the air. The little art center was now surrounded by trees that looked as if they had been set on fire by the changing season, and the girls spent their afternoons jumping into piles of leaves, their laughter echoing down the quiet street. Life had settled into something that resembled peace, messy, imperfect, and wholly real. Graham had become a fixture in their lives, no longer a visitor or a guest. He didn't ask for permission anymore to pick the girls up from school or sit at the dinner table. It happened gradually, then all at once. He was simply there, every morning to help braid hair or button tiny coats, every night to read one more story when the girls begged for it, every moment in between that mattered. Madison had allowed him in fully now, not just into their home but into the vulnerable spaces of her heart she had spent years guarding. It wasn't easy at first. She had lived too long relying on only herself. But one evening, as they danced barefoot in the living room with the girls to some silly old jazz record, she realized that she no longer felt the weight of doing it all alone. He was shouldering it with her, not out of guilt or obligation, but because he chose to. The girls began calling him Dad. It happened without prompting. One morning, Bella ran into the kitchen yelling, "Daddy, I can't find my other shoe." Graham froze when he heard it, looked at Madison for confirmation, but she only smiled softly and shrugged. "You heard her," she said. "Better help her find it." He never corrected them. He never questioned it. He stepped fully into the role with a quiet devotion that stunned even himself. It wasn't performative. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about being there, present, consistent, imperfect, but always trying. Madison continued to paint, her work evolving with her life. Her style had grown more vivid, more expressive, but also more hopeful. One of her new series featured mothers and daughters in everyday moments, tending gardens, walking hand in hand through foggy mornings, brushing tangled hair. At the center of her most personal painting stood a man, just slightly off-center, steady, watching, his presence anchoring the chaos around him. She called the piece "Found." A month before the first snowfall, Graham asked her to take a walk with him after the girls had gone to bed. They bundled in coats and scarves and walked the quiet, leaf-strewn roads in comfortable silence. He seemed distracted, hands deep in his pockets, eyes scanning the trees. When they reached the edge of the little lake just past town, he stopped. The moon reflected off the water, lighting the scene in silver. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "You think a lot," Madison teased gently, nudging his shoulder. "I do," he admitted. "But I don't want to think this part to death. I just want to say it." He turned toward her then and pulled something from his coat pocket. It wasn't flashy, a simple, delicate ring with a single small diamond, elegant and understated. He held it in his palm, but didn't drop to one knee. "I don't want to erase the past," he said. "It brought us here. But I want a future. With you. With them. Whatever that looks like. This doesn't have to be a fairy tale. I just want it to be real. Will you marry me, Madison?" She didn't cry. She didn't gasp. Instead, she smiled in a way that made everything else disappear. "Yes," she said, taking his hand. "But not because of the past. Because of the man you are now." They walked home hand in hand under the stars, the quiet between them warm and steady. Their wedding was small, held in the backyard, beneath the old oak tree where the girls often played. The triplets wore flower crowns and tossed petals with theatrical flair, and Madison walked barefoot down the aisle holding all three of their hands. Graham stood at the end, waiting not with nerves, but with peace. They exchanged vows written in quiet moments between bedtime stories and breakfast dishes, promises built on small truths: "I will be there. I will listen. I will stay." Afterward, the girls insisted they all dance together, and for the first time, their family was whole in every possible way, not because it was perfect, but because it was chosen, day by day, against all odds. In the years that followed, their lives remained full of paint stains and mismatched socks and lost lunchboxes and occasional tears. But also joy, deep, quiet, sustainable joy. Graham and Madison built their life not from grand gestures, but from simple ones: showing up, staying, loving without condition. And sometimes, when Madison sat on the porch with a cup of tea in hand, listening to the girls giggle inside and Graham humming off-key in the kitchen, she would think about how much she once feared that doorbell ringing years ago. Now she couldn't imagine her world without it. This story's ending speaks not to fantasy, but to the quiet, powerful truth that real love is built, not rescued. What makes the conclusion so moving isn't the reunion or the proposal, but the earned trust, the slow rebuilding of what once was carelessly broken. Graham's transformation isn't a sudden epiphany but a choice repeated every day: to stay, to show up, to grow into the man he once refused to become. Madison, in turn, doesn't just forgive, she evolves. She doesn't accept him out of nostalgia, but because he proves that people can change if they're willing to face the cost of who they used to be. The children, the small town, the art, all serve as mirrors of healing, not decoration. This isn't a story of perfect people, but of flawed ones who take the long road back to each other. That's what makes it beautiful. The ending doesn't promise a flawless future, it promises something better, an honest one. And in today's world, that kind of hope is its own kind of miracle.